I thought my nightmare ended the day my house was stolen, but returning to pack the final box revealed a dark secret hidden in the walls that turned me into a target for a dangerous criminal network. They spent 7 years using me as a pawn for their organized scheme. But they made one fatal mistake. They underestimated exactly how much I was willing to destroy to get my life back. 7 years ago, my life wasn't just dismantled, it was incinerated. I was the wife of a rising architect, living in a suburban dream that felt like a movie set. Until Sarah moved in next door. She was the classic charity case neighbor, the woman who needed help with her lawn, her groceries, and eventually my husband's undivided attention. She played the long game with the patience of a spider. By the time I realized what was happening, my bank accounts were drained, my reputation was systematically shredded, and I was being served divorce papers in the middle of a grocery store aisle. Sarah didn't just want my husband, she wanted my life. She wanted my house, my social circle, and the hollowed-out shell of the woman I used to be. When the dust settled, she moved into our marital home, the place where I had raised my daughter while I crawled back to a studio apartment in the city, working 3 jobs just to keep the lights on. I spent years in a fog of resentment, telling myself that karma would eventually find her address. But time has a funny way of making you forget the sharp edges of your pain, or so I thought. Last month, I got a call from an old acquaintance. Sarah had finally moved out. The house was being sold, and due to a bizarre, lingering legal stipulation from the original deed, one that required a signature from the former occupant in the event of a specific title transfer, I was the only one who could finalize the paperwork. I didn't want to go back. Stepping onto that property felt like walking into a graveyard of my own memories. But the lawyer insisted, and honestly, a small, dark part of me wanted to see the ruins of the place where my life had collapsed. When I arrived, the house was a shell of its former glory. The landscaping Sarah had once obsessed over was overgrown, and the exterior paint was peeling like dead skin. I signed the documents in the dusty foyer, my hands trembling as I avoided looking at the wall where our family portrait once hung. The realtor, a nervous man who clearly wanted me gone as quickly as possible, handed me a box of leftovers found in the crawlspace, claiming it was legally my property under the settlement terms. I didn't care about the contents, but I took it, just to feel like I was taking something back from the woman who had stolen everything. I drove back to the city, the box rattling on the passenger seat. That night, with a glass of cheap wine in hand, I decided to open it. It was mostly trash, old receipts, broken ornaments, and shredded documents. But at the very bottom, tucked beneath a heavy, velvet-lined pouch, was a leather-bound journal. It wasn't mine. It was hers. I started reading, expecting to find nothing more than pathetic entries about her win against me. Instead, I found a detailed ledger. It wasn't just about my husband. There were names, dates, and amounts of money that didn't make sense. And then I saw it. A series of notes about the supply, the transportation routes, and a terrifying reference to an organized scheme that had used my house as a silent hub for years. The color drained from my face as I turned the page. There was a photo tucked inside, an old Polaroid of Sarah standing in the garage, holding a crate filled with packets of substance. She wasn't just a home wrecker. She was a middleman for a network I'd only read about in the news. I looked closer at the final entry, dated just 2 days before she moved out. It was a frantic handwritten note, written in shaking cursive. It read, "They know it was me. I'm leaving, but I've hidden the evidence in the walls of the nursery. If they find me, I'm dead. But if they find the stash, I'm going away for an enormous term. I've made sure the new owner inherits everything. My phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was an unknown number. I answered, my heart hammering against my ribs, expecting a debt collector or a wrong number. Instead, a cold, gravelly voice whispered through the speaker. "You shouldn't have gone back to the house, Sarah's replacement. We know you have the ledger, and we're already in your driveway." The silence in my apartment after that voice cut the connection was deafening. My pulse roared in my ears, a frantic drumbeat of pure adrenaline. I dropped the phone as if it had turned into a burning coal, the plastic casing clattering against the hardwood floor. Outside, the streetlights cast long, shivering shadows across my living room. But through the glass of my balcony door, I saw it. A sleek, dark sedan idling at the curb. The headlights were extinguished, but the engine hummed with a low, predatory vibration that I could feel in the soles of my feet. They weren't police. They weren't coming to hand me a warrant. The mention of the enormous term and the organized scheme Sarah had been running left no room for legal niceties. These were the people who cleaned up loose ends. I looked down at the leather-bound journal still resting on my lap, the evidence that had just turned my life into a target. Sarah hadn't just left behind a mess, she had set a trap. By leaving that ledger in the crawl space and ensuring I, the former owner, would be the one to find it, she had successfully framed me as her accomplice. In the eyes of the law, I was the one who signed for the property. In the eyes of the criminals, I was the person who knew too much. Panic clawed at my throat, but I forced myself to move. I grabbed my purse, stuffed the ledger deep into the lining of my coat, and scrambled toward the back fire escape. The building was old, a creaky maze of hallways and damp stairwells, and I knew every shortcut. As I descended the rusted metal steps, I heard the heavy thud of a car door closing out front. Boots crunched on the pavement, calculated, rhythmic, and purposeful. I didn't have a plan. I didn't even have a car. I just had the truth, and apparently that was enough to get me erased. I ran through the alleyways, the scent of damp garbage and city exhaust filling my lungs, until I reached the main road. I needed to reach the authorities, but who could I trust? The ledger mentioned names that appeared to be linked to high-ranking officials. If I walked into a station, I might be walking directly into the arms of the very people Sarah had been working for. I ducked into a 24-hour diner, the bell above the door chiming with a jarring, cheerful sound that felt like a mockery of my terror. I huddled in a corner booth, pulling my coat tight, my eyes darting to every person who walked through the door. I pulled out my phone, intending to call the only person who might believe me, a retired detective who had handled my divorce case 7 years ago. My fingers hovered over the keypad, but before I could press call, my phone flashed a notification. It was a photo, sent from an unknown number. It was a picture of me, taken less than 30 seconds ago, sitting in that very booth. The caption read, "We can see you through the window. Leave the ledger on the table and walk out the back door. Do not look back, or you won't make it to the parking lot." My stomach turned. I glanced toward the front glass. A man in a dark coat stood on the sidewalk, his hand tucked into his jacket as if holding a piece of illegal weaponry. He wasn't rushing. He was waiting. I knew that if I left the ledger, I was condemning myself, but if I held on to it, I was a dead woman walking. I looked at the server, a tired woman in her 50s, and saw she was distracted by a commotion in the kitchen. I slipped out of the booth, moving toward the restrooms, my heart screaming at me to keep running. I reached the service door, but as I grabbed the handle, it swung open from the outside. A shadow fell across the tiles, and a cold, firm hand clamped onto my shoulder, spinning me around. It was the realtor from that morning. He looked terrified, his face pale and slick with sweat. He leaned in, his voice a frantic whisper. "You don't understand. The house wasn't the target. You were. They knew you'd come for the box. And now they've already triggered the internal notification." Before I could ask what he meant, he thrust a burner phone into my hand. "A representative from the Service of Internal Safety is on the line. Don't speak, just listen. If you want to survive, you need to hear what they've been hiding in the basement of that house." I pressed the phone to my ear, and a voice, calm, detached, and chillingly familiar, spoke the final words that froze the blood in my veins. "We've been watching your house for 7 years, and we knew exactly when Sarah left. We didn't want the ledger. We wanted to see if you were smart enough to find the hidden camera in the nursery." The floor beneath my feet seemed to dissolve. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. For 7 years, I hadn't just been a victim of Sarah's schemes, I had been a test subject. The internal safety officer on the other end of the line didn't wait for my shock to subside. "The nursery in that house was never intended for a child," he continued, his voice devoid of empathy. "It was an acoustic and visual laboratory. Every conversation you had, every tear you shed, and every move you made after the divorce was recorded. Sarah was merely the handler, the person we paid to ensure you remained tethered to that property. Why? Because you were the perfect cover. Nobody suspects the grieving, ruined ex-wife." I felt bile rise in my throat. I looked at the realtor who was trembling so violently his teeth were chattering. "He's telling the truth," the realtor sobbed. "I was just the middleman. They promised me a percentage of the sales if I kept the house occupied by someone who would never investigate the basement. I didn't know it was that deep, I swear." I didn't wait for his excuses. I shoved him aside and bolted out the service door, fueled by a mixture of white-hot rage and survival instinct. I didn't run away from the danger. I ran toward it. I knew exactly where the nursery was, and I knew that if they had been watching me for 7 years, they had accumulated enough data to destroy half the city's political elite. If I was going to be their pawn, I would be a pawn that took the whole chessboard down with me. I drove back to the house, the burner phone clutched in my lap like a grenade. When I pulled into the driveway, the dark sedan was gone, but the house stood silent and imposing under the moonlight. I didn't enter through the front door. I went around the side to the cellar entrance I'd kept locked for years. I knew the layout better than anyone. I bypassed the main living areas and went straight to the wall in the nursery where Sarah had hinted the stash was hidden. I didn't find packages of substances. I found a centralized hub, a server room disguised behind the drywall. Rows of hard drives blinked with eerie, rhythmic blue lights. They had been uploading everything in real time to an off-site cloud. I pulled the master drive from its slot, the heat of the machinery stinging my palms. Just then, the front door creaked open. Heavy, measured footsteps echoed through the hallway. They were inside. I didn't panic. I remembered the ledger. I had shoved it into a secondary compartment of the drive casing. I walked out of the nursery, stepping into the hallway as 3 figures in tactical gear rounded the corner. They stopped, surprised to see me standing there, empty-handed and calm. The leader stepped forward, his face obscured by a mask. "You've made a mistake," he growled. "Hand over the drive, and you might live to see tomorrow." "I've already lived through the worst thing you could possibly do to me," I replied, my voice steady. I pulled out my phone and tapped the screen once. It wasn't a call to the police. It was a pre-programmed upload command. "I've just sent the access keys to the Service of Internal Safety's main server. the local news, and every major investigative agency in the country. If my heart stops beating in the next 5 minutes, an automated system makes sure the entire world sees who has been running this organized scheme from inside our own government. The tension in the room was absolute. The leader stared at me, his finger twitching near his sidearm. He knew I wasn't bluffing. If they killed me, they would lose everything they had built. The leverage had shifted, and for the first time in 7 years, I was the one holding the cards. "Get out," I said, pointing toward the door, "and if I ever see you again, I'll make sure the fallout is loud enough to be heard in the next century." They didn't argue. They understood that the game was over. They retreated, vanishing into the night as quickly as they had arrived. I stayed in that house until dawn, watching the sun rise through the window of the room that had once been my prison. I wasn't just a woman who had lost her home. I was the woman who had exposed a shadow empire. Sarah was arrested 3 days later in a border town, fleeing with nothing. As for me, I sold the house, not to a developer, but to the city to be demolished. I walked away from the rubble of my past, finally free, knowing that the secrets they thought they'd hidden were now the foundation of their downfall. I had lost 7 years of my life, but I had gained the one thing they could never steal back: my future.